he rolls up his sleeves when he gets involved in all of his investments. This man is on message. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please put your hands together for the Managing Director of Yeoman's Capital, David Johnson, and the panel.
Thank you, thank you. So let me welcome up Charles, Kahina, and Michael. I'm really honored to have these folks on our panel today. For those of you that are newer to the industry, Charles and Michael have spent an enormous amount of time building and evangelizing the blockchain ecosystem, and we're happy to have Kahina here today, who's joined the ecosystem from the traditional side and bringing her expertise from banking to this industry. So welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
Great. Well, I just want to jump right in. This is one of the topics I'm most passionate about, and I've been making sort of prognostications for a while. I don't know if you, Michael or Charles, you guys remember in 2014, I said, I think by 2020, we can get to 1 billion users. And we're probably at 50 million, 60 million wallet installs, so we've come a long way.
You got the $10,000 Bitcoin.
There you go. And so I'm just curious, in your guys' view, what's going to get us from, let's say we're getting close to 100 million wallets, to that first billion users, and really cross the chasm there. Charles, you want to start us off?
So what do you mean by user?
Wallet installs, preferably somebody that's actively engaged. I mean, traditional metrics, right? You talk about monthly active users, or if you're WhatsApp, you get daily active users if you're a chat app. But you tell me, what's the right metric in this ecosystem?
I tend to look at this always in terms of two worlds. And so there's the US, European Union, the developed world, and then you have emerging developing markets. In terms of the developed world, what I always say is it should fade into the backdrop. What our metric ought to be is VoIP. It was this mystical, magical thing back in the day, and everybody's like, wow, video conferencing, wow, I can just talk to somebody over the internet, that's so cool. And now it's in everything, right? It's in Skype and Facebook Messenger, and there are billions of people who regularly use these products, but we don't think too much about them. So cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology in the Western world, I hope, has that level of adoption, where it gets white labeled, and you might not even realize you're using a token or using a payment system that's blockchain based. You just are. In the developing world, it's a very different story. You're talking about a leapfrog effect, where these economies must modernize. They must adopt new standards, and they have a distinct opportunity to actually be very creative with their financial systems. They can create new currencies, they can create completely new ways of doing KYC/AML and contracts, and there you have a much closer to the consumer relationship with cryptocurrencies.
And similar to what we've seen with M-Pesa famously.
Exactly, and there's a lot of ventures that are trying to innovate there, like Stellar is definitely running around Africa, as are we. Vinny's trying to make a play in Uganda, and so there's a lot of people who are actively getting involved and investing, and we'll see a large-scale adoption, in my view, over the next 24, 36 months there. And those are, I think, much closer to the users we're used to, because they're actually installing clients and using wallets, whereas the Western world, those users are probably just going to wake up and suddenly Facebook Messenger has a cryptocurrency or Skype has a cryptocurrency.
So I guess that's just to build on that, Kahina. Is there something where you see this is going to be an organic revolution, where it's closer to the user in developing world, or do you think it's going to be the legacy rails and the older companies coming into the industry and dragging people in through their existing user base? I'm curious on your view.
I think it comes from both sides. So, hello Zurich, guten Tag, freut mich hier zu sein. I think about financial services. I'm so glad we just talked about M-Pesa, and we talked about the use cases in the high growth markets. I like to call them the emerging high growth markets versus the developed markets. If payments and financial services is just what people do all the time. And if a platform is really, really good, mass adoption is when the platform falls into the background and it just works. And when the internet came to banking, and I was employee number 7 at Citibank in the late 90s, and no one believed that people would ever look at any financial information online, They refused to let us capture email address because they said it wasn't safe to send PDF statements online. And then they told us never, ever, ever, ever would anybody look at their bank account and transact. And it was true for a good 4 or 5 or 6 years. And so I think about that experience around getting the big movers. And I was at Citibank for 10 years, I was at MasterCard for 6 years, I've worked in the high growth and the developed, and it always happens slower than we think, and then it becomes bigger than we could even have imagined. But the innovators in the high growth markets are really interesting because M-Pesa launched probably about 14 years ago. And they showed the big guys what was possible. So I do think you're going to see out the innovation around identity because they need identity. They need payment solutions in these markets. East Africa, West Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America, they need it, so they will innovate first. And blockchain has some great opportunities for them, and slowly the adoption will come from the bigger guys, but they're more risk averse, so I think it's going to come both ways.
That's great. And Michael, you get a lot of exposure as part of the MIT related crowd to a lot of the innovation that's going on. Do you think there's a particular innovation that we need in order to reach mass adoption, or is it purely a question of now propagating what we've already invented to larger and larger audiences over time?
No, there's still a lot of development that needs to happen, and it's happening, as I mentioned in my address, in this distributed way with multiple different projects like Charles's and others working very hard at some core problems. And I think if you look at the software stack, it's partly the protocol level, right? We need to have scaling capacity so there's throughput of transactions and everything else that maintains the spirit of decentralization at the same time. So that is to happen there. And then, of course, at the top end is the UX, which, if to answer your question put to Charles, if we are talking about adoption from that organic level where it's the individual, let's face it, it's still a huge mental barrier for a lot of people to get onto a wallet and buy Bitcoin. It doesn't feel like a natural organic thing to do. So there's still a lot of work that needs to happen at that front end. So I think, yes, there's a lot of work going on that. I'm excited by the work that's going on right now in this lull period. It's really encouraging to see just how many projects, again, Charles's presentation talking about all of those academic papers that are getting done, right? So there's a lot of work going on. I think sometimes the community can be a little bit navel-gazy and focus too much on the really interesting crypto problems to solve, when we've really got this user base that we need to be thinking about as well. So yeah, still lots of work to do, but it's moving in the right direction.
And that's great, and I think you hit on an important point, which is user experience is key. I'm a big fan of a Cointext, which just came out recently with their beta that allows you to directly text to somebody's phone number, cryptocurrency, automatically sets up a wallet. They don't have to download anything. They don't have to know what a Bitcoin or Ethereum address is in order to use it. And so I'm hoping that as that matures and we figure out the security models around that can really bring a lot of people in. But Charles, you've got an enormous amount of experience when it comes to building crypto communities. And so I'm curious to get your view on this topic of scalability, of how we scale the incentives around people being involved in those communities. Of course, we had proof of work when this started out, and anybody could access the ecosystem with standard hardware they could buy off the rack. Today, that's become very industrialized with application-specific integrated circuits, hardware dedicated to mining. What's your long-term view on how we incentivize people to be involved in those space layer protocols, and as Michael said, maintain a lot of that decentralization?
Well, I guess the first lesson is to look to the past, and you have to see the things that have taken off and what hasn't. And one of the biggest lessons you can learn from the past is the things you tend to prioritize personally as an engineer or a scientist or just as a person may not necessarily be what everybody else prioritizes. The greatest example of that would be the emergence of PGP. I mean, if you go to a person and say, hey, how would you like for free to be able to have secure communication and a password-free internet? It's just one click to log into a website, no username, no password, you don't ever have to remember everything, and it's far more secure than the existing paradigm. Well, we've had that capability since 1991 with Web of Trust and PGP, but it never took off. So even though these things sound like great ideas, and you would figure people would have an incentive to adopt this, if the user experience isn't where it needs to be and it's somewhat inaccessible, it's just never really going to get where it needs to go. Second, you have to look at why people are joining the ecosystem. There's a lot of different groups. In our days, when we came in, I mean, there wasn't a lot of money to be made in the space, so it was mostly philosophy. You know, there was a lot of Ron Paul guys, and there was a lot of cypherpunks and people who said, hey, we love alternative monies and private monies. So that philosophical momentum allowed us to grow to a certain critical mass and keep the system resilient and alive, but it was somewhat insular. You know, it was kind of one of those, you had to speak the hidden words and know the code words and the language, and you know, you had to have the right handshakes and so forth. So then this banking class came in, and we said, who the hell are these guys? And why are you messing up our party? And so that was a bit challenging. So one of the things I've noticed, in addition to learning from the past, is you have to understand that when you start growing, eventually you will create different interest groups which are not going to get along. There's no greater example of that than Bitcoin Cash and Ethereum Classic, where you have this dissent and this friction, and they just grate on each other, and eventually they just have irreconcilable differences and split and create alternative ecosystems. And that's okay. Managing that fallout, I think, is one of the hallmarks of good ecosystems. If you can have disagreements and you can have dissent and that can break apart, that's just as meaningful as your ability to bring people into the ecosystem. So those are, I think, two of the biggest lessons, is start with what hasn't worked and try to understand, well, why hasn't it worked, and then also find a ways to manage people coming and manage people going. You have to pay attention to both sides, and you keep together. You remember NXT?
Sure.
Yeah. NXT could have been Ethereum. They actually could have eaten our lunch, guys. They had everything. They had a great community. They had money. They had a strong code base. They actually had smart contract ideas. They had asset issuance. You could have more easily done an ICO in 2014 on NXT than you could have on Ethereum. We didn't even have ERC20. It wasn't out. Why didn't they win? Because the community self-cannibalized. They tore each other apart, and they fractured into a lot of different projects, and everybody went off into their own directions. So it's not who has the best technology, it's who's able to navigate and manage the ebbs and flows and the personalities of the community, which is why we've seen projects like Ethereum succeed.
Michael?
Yeah, just got me thinking about Ethereum. I mean, one of the things Ethereum, or rather the Ethereum community, and so Consensus is part of this, and others were involved in it, some of the Berlin-based Ethereum crowd as well. They've got a really good design aesthetic, right? There's something cool about the Ethereal Summit in New York. I was the MC of a big Ethereum-focused energy project event called Event Horizon in Berlin, and it was cool. The rotating stage, everything else. All of this might sound superfluous, but actually design is critical to adoption, right? So it's one of the things MIT Media Lab is where I work, is this is a core element of what they're saying, is that you've got to have the functionality, you've got to have the use case, but you also have to have design. I mean, industrial design is what, the iPhone was successful, not because necessarily at its early stage, it was that much better than a BlackBerry, but it had enough sort of design features that people were like, this is cool, this interacts with my life, this makes me feel good. And I just think like NXT, I thought NXT was a really interesting project as well, but where was its branding? Where was its external stuff? We tend to think, and I think people in the crypto community, cynically about marketing, which is a healthy way to think because the marketers can take over. But at the same time, what is your aesthetic? What is your way? What is your go-to-market strategy in terms of how you reach out with those design principles? I think this is a really important moment right now when it comes to adoption, to think about some of these things.
Yeah, I just would love to add on that, because I think there's a big difference between marketing and the engagement with the user of technology. And we have seen, as users have adopted technology, they couldn't have imagined 20 years ago that you'd be doing FaceTime and doing video calling, and people couldn't have imagined in all these ways that they are using technology to enhance their lives. But the technology falls into the background when you have really good design and you think about the way that that person, that human being, is engaging with technology. And I will agree that for mass adoption, mass consumer user adoption, that next 1 billion, that part will have to get right.
No, I think that's critical, and I think you hit on an important point, which is sort of this critical mass. And one thing we did see with NXT, I think it only was, correct me if I'm wrong, I remember off the top of my head that like 75 participants
For the ICO, yeah.
for their token sale.
Yeah.
And that small, very insular community proved not to have the critical mass to get people involved. I mean, Ethereum had, 17,000 participants off the top of my head.
Yeah.
And that proved a very large community and incentivizing and wanting those people to be
because
involved.
those people had incentives to be surrogates and propagate the message. You need a certain critical density of surrogacy to be able to propagate a message. But it's unclear how big that core needs to be, but it's probably larger than 1,000 members.
Well, there's a new type of community building that people have been experimenting with. Quick survey of the crowd. How many people have heard of airdrops? Quick show of hands. So almost everybody has heard of airdrops, right? And people have been exploring this as a way of building community. And it sort of started as this, you remember Aurora?
I remember, yeah. That was Iceland.
Yeah, they airdropped to everybody in Iceland.
Wrote a piece for the journal.
This Aurora coin.
Aurora coin, yeah.
But that proved not so effective. I think because one, it
It was
ended up
cool,
being a
though.
very small amount per person.
Yeah.
Right. I think we've seen better examples more recently with things like Polymath, where anybody could sign up. They go through KYC. They would, join the Telegram group, and all of a sudden they had 50,000 participants in their Telegram group. But they airdropped enough, whereas a few $100s per person, it was really a meaningful amount. It wasn't just a dust amount in an address that I opened up my Ether wallet. I don't know what this project is, and I'm not going to find out, right?
So what you're saying is we have to figure out how much the bribe needs to be.
Well, if I were to map this traditional software, you have a cost of user acquisition.
Yeah.
And as long as the lifetime user value is higher than the user acquisition cost, it makes sense, right? And I've seen a few studies.
You've been in Silicon Valley a long time.
Austin, Texas, but it's basically the new Silicon Valley. So I hang out here in Zurich a lot. But I'm curious what you guys think of these new approaches to getting people involved. Now that we're getting tools like Cointext, where imagine you could airdrop to somebody's phone number. They could sign up. They already have KYC.
So we did an experiment, and I wasn't part of it at that time. It was before my time at MIT, but you might remember it as well. It was in either early 2015 or it was late 2014, and it emerged out of Sloan, and it was an airdrop of Bitcoin for every single student on MIT campus. And it was a reasonable. It was $100 actually, I think is what it was, worth of Bitcoin. So this was funded by some tool, and they were just trying to see what were students going to do with it, and they pretty much cashed it back into dollars as soon as they could, right? So, I think it's valuable, and I really do like the idea of treating it as user acquisition costs, as an alternative form of marketing. And if you think about it, it's a really effective way to market, not just because you're spending dollars literally on acquisition with each one of those as a user, but now you've got data on that user. Let's not call it Big Brother-like data where you know their name and they're doxing them and everything else. But on the other hand, you have so much more valuable data about how your marketing is going on by being able to sort of track the movements of these coins and so forth. So there's an interesting way to flip the whole marketing logic on its head within that model that I think I think you're onto something, but at the same time, there's just got to be some practical value to use the token for the decentralized application that it's supposed to be used for, rather than just cashing out the back end.
Well, that was the key with Polymath. They gave you 250 poly because that was the amount you needed to issue a security token on the Polymath platform. And I'm seeing some of the newer projects basically restrict the use of their token, so you don't get the cash out problem, to the use of their protocol. So Open Garden has done this recently with distributed bandwidth. Now we're giving you free bandwidth. The tokens that you're getting are used in the protocol.
In effect, it's not even money, really. It's the value, it's the digital asset that is an integral part of the infrastructure, and you're now going to have access to that infrastructure. Right?
Any thoughts on that, Charles?
On bribing people to join your platform? My Microsoft is probably the biggest offender of that. They tried for years and spent tens of billions of dollars with Paving, and they never had a lot of success. Airdrops are cool because it doesn't cost you anything to do the bribe. So you're just like, here's some free tokens, and it didn't cost me anything to give it to you. And then somehow the market values that. A token is just a reflection of a community, and it's only valuable if there happens to be people behind it. And so even if people sell, if enough critical mass hold on to the token for long enough, and they actually grow the community from that, it'll accrue value. There's no greater example of that than Ethereum Classic, where this was a contentious fork, and about 80 to 90% of the ecosystem was pro-Ethereum, and only a small sliver was Ethereum Classic. That's fine, but here's the issue. The 80 to 90% held Ether Classic. So what they did is they dumped, and it really hurt the price for a while, but the vigilant people at the base held on, and now it's a viable ecosystem which grows. So an airdrop can be effective in terms of customer acquisition. It's also a really good way to distribute something where you just can't figure out a distribution model. Like, for example, let's say you just say, hey, look, I have this great product. I don't want to do an ICO. I don't need funding, and I don't want to go mine and have that whole ecosystem materialize. So screw it. I'm just going to airdrop the Bitcoin distribution or the Ethereum distribution, and let's see how many people we get. And it'd be nice to see some empirical evidence of whether they stay or not. I mean, Steam had this issue where they gave tons of free tokens out, right, and, for curation, and everybody just sold. So do they hold on to it? And if they hold on to it, do they evangelize and bring people into the platform? I just haven't seen enough hard data to know that.
No,
Sorry,
makes sense.
can I just want to add, because it reminds me so much, I'm the old school banker that he was talking about that comes into the community, and thank you for welcoming me. But I think that this whole idea of bribery, this is the oldest thing in the book. PayPal got adoption because they started giving people $5 and $10 to take PayPal. But if PayPal had not had any usage and they could not use it in a substantive way, it wouldn't have worked. So I do think you can't just bribe people and have it full of air. It has to be substantive and it has to be usable.
In crypto speak, we'd say you need a medium of exchange to make a store of wealth a true store of wealth.
That sounds better. That's what I'll say next year.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we're just wrapping up. We've got a couple more minutes. So curious on last thoughts from each of you, just for 30, 45 seconds on where you think this is going the next few years. Are we going to get to our billion first users? And what does that look like? What are the use cases that are going to get those people really involved? Because we saw this with the internet, right? The internet didn't matter to anybody until their favorite website had the sports they were watching or something that was relevant to them. Then all of a sudden, it was something worth having. Charles?
Okay. Well, once Cardano has displaced Bitcoin, and it's number one on the market cap, we'll get all the adoption. I mean, what will happen is we'll continue to see a multipolar ecosystem with hundreds of cryptocurrencies, and we'll just see lots of new players entering the space, especially on the regulated side. If you look at market cap, it's probably next 24 months going to be a lot of regulated instruments.
Sure.
We'll see a lot more regulatory clarity occur, which will bring institutional money into the space. So from a market capitalization side, that's going to have another big wave. And I think we'll break $1 trillion in market cap, which will naturally bring lots of people into the ecosystem. In terms of user experience, that's getting considerably better. People who care about user experience are now involved in the space, and they're building beautiful products, and those products will be consumerizable. Design is important. We care about it. Go to our website, you'll see how much we care about it. And there's a lot of people who do care about that, and they're coming up with cool alternative ways to do things. So I think we'll see great adoption over the next 12, 24 months. I don't know if we'll reach $1 billion, but we're on the road there, and we're not turning back.
That's great.
The path to $1 billion. I mean, I believe in this. I believe in that global banking infrastructure has to evolve. I believe that when we evolve and are on that pathway to $1 billion, a critical component of that is the infrastructure layer. And as that infrastructure layer gets more efficient and as blockchain gets more adopted by the larger players in the market, it will bring new participants in, and we'll have a more equitable distribution of prosperity in the world because there will be more people in this system. So I'm a big believer in the path to $1 billion. That's why I'm here, and it's going to be fun watching it.
That's great. Michael, you got last word?
Okay, I'll pick up on the point that I made in my presentation before, and that is that I do think that when you're talking about value, and it's not just cryptocurrencies as a medium of exchange, but any form of digital value, this question of trust in the issuer is still going to be there. So one of the problems I think we faced with the whole ICO boom is not just the regulatory threat, but also the perception that there's an asymmetry there of the interest of the founders in this. So messaging and making sure that things like airdrops, if they're well designed and so forth, are not seen as a bribe, but rather as seen as truly in the interest of building a decentralized community, then that's going to be critical. Adoption will be much easier if that particular trust problem is resolved as early as possible.
Wonderful. Want to thank them and give us a big round of applause. Thank you, everybody, for your time today.